I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge, it doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
As modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
All right. So I'm here with Spencer Hess and Emily Larner. And tonight we're going to be talking about a venture that Spencer got himself into several years ago. What? You don't like that? You want me to start again?
I'm just happy to be on a podcast.
Anyway, a project that Spencer got into a few years ago, and how that all turned out. We've been talking on Dustbowl Diatribes about in sort of a mini series within our larger series about urban agriculture and just not just that, but the challenges of small business people as well in the urban setting relative to more or less big capital. And Spencer has his own story, so we're here to talk about that tonight and lay it all out, because I think our viewers have never really heard this story, and it's really rather interesting, and it's pretty incredible where you've ended up compared to where you started. So anyway, we're co-hosts here, but tonight I'm sort of interviewing you, and Emily's here because now she's a part of the story too. So why don't we go ahead and get started? So as I understand it, in order to discuss this appropriately, we do need to kind of go back to the beginning, as in what got you started down the path towards trying to form a collective, which ended up being called the Mort Collective. And you can tell people what that means, what that stands for, but tell us how you started heading down that path and got to the point where you tried to start this up in Kansas City, Missouri.
Well, so some people would say it probably started at about 6 months old when my parents dropped me on my head and then I fell down the stairs and I was
nice.
But I think you do have to be crazy to want to do this. The long and the short of it, and this is kind of like a throwback to that first interview you ever did with me back on your political philosophy channel. But from age like 19 to 21, I got sucked into like left liberal politics. And I was like, well, clearly Republicans are full of shit. So obviously Democrats might be fine. And I just need to learn how to become a Democrat. And then if I can convince everybody else to be a Democrat, then all the problems in the world will be like more or less resolved. You know, now it's crude to put it that way. And I wasn't like totally utopian, but like I had this kind of sophomoric mentality about me. And like, the more I looked into things, the more I like noticed the contradictions of liberalism, the more I realized that like our food system, how we produce our food is bad for like every party involved, other than like the abstract domination of capital. Like it's bad for the soil, it's bad for the animals, it's bad for the people. Like it's just not good, unless the point is to produce as much quantity of food as possible with as little quantity of labor, of human labor as possible.
You might want to explain to folks why your mind went to food.
Well, partly it came out of my research is like at that time on Netflix was kind of blowing up, and I was exposed to like Food Inc. But I guess the connection is I got more and more radical in the sense of like trying to get to the root of issues. And I think it's a pretty obvious thing that like agriculture is the foundation of civilization. And so if you really want to make change, or if you really think that there are problems in the world, I think you have to at least in part connect it to food. And that was a pretty obvious thing for me to think at like around age 20, 21. Now you would say that's not an obvious thought for most people. And that's where I start to have like a nervous breakdown because I don't understand how people think then. But
well, and your family is somewhat in farming.
Yeah, sure. They own acreage that's industrially farmed. Yes.
Right. So that might have had something to do with it as well.
It might have, sure. And yeah, so from there, I don't know. I went through a whole journey of like maturation in terms of like developing my politics and religious outlook and all sorts of things. And that I would say that all started about age 21. I'm 31 now. But at age 21, I realized that like the Democratic Party and liberalism in general was like incredibly internally contradictory, that we can't get the world we want unless we basically get rid of capitalism, or at least begin to make radical choices within capitalism to at least somewhat shift the parameters of what's possible. I grasped that at age 21, and I didn't know if I was some sort of like, I didn't know these words at the time, but I basically sensed that like, I don't know if I'm like a Marxist or an anarchist or like a Burkean agrarian conservative or what, but I knew like I was not interested in like mainstream American politics anymore. More than anything because of the influence of like Chris Hedges and his Death of the Liberal Class book and watching The Wire, that just so thoroughly lays out how impotent left liberal politics is in the face of capitalism. And I think that's true.
So you got that far in your thinking primarily by reading stuff and by sort of just observing and thinking about it.
Yes.
And so then what'd you do with that?
Well, I left home. I settled at least for a year in Springfield, Missouri. I worked on a really great organic farm. I just read a bunch and I talked with people a bunch and I listened to tons of podcasts. And then eventually I went back to K-State, which is where I met you. And then everything just continued. You know, for me, some people would say I've changed a lot from age like 21 to 31 and through all these phases from just being an apprentice farmer to like starting Mort to like Mort's clearly failed. And now we're reincorporating as the John Paul II Catholic worker farm. Externally, you know, like you kind of said it at the beginning, a lot of things have changed. I kind of don't feel like very much has changed because to me, there's always been this constant thread from the soil to our social existence to God, basically. And so when you met me at K-State, I was studying horticulture, but I had this interest in like philosophy and political theory. And I made some sort of an impression on you, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. You seem kind of unusual, let's say that, for just the amount of things you'd already put together, as well as kind of the convictions that you had and where you wanted to go. I didn't meet too many students that had it, put together fairly well.
And why is that? Why aren't people put together well?
You keep asking. You've asked me that question so many times. I wish I could give you a better answer than I do. I suspect that people don't take the time, which is to say it's a matter of kind of will, to a certain extent, because we're talking about students who are at a university, so they're not out there, working 60 to 80 hours a week, right, at that point, right? Yes, they're sometimes working a job or two, but they are at a university. So we're talking about people who ostensibly are here to learn things and to think.
Mm-hmm.
But most of them don't slow down or actually take the time to do it. And I suppose I don't know why. I still don't know why. I wish it were not so, but it is a rare quality. And so even though you were, I guess I felt like there was still some room to kind of bake, that you were more baked than a lot of people I met, and quite interesting. And I found it hard to argue with some of the points that you made. So I started to learn a little bit from you, which is also unusual for me in a student, setting.
Mm-hmm. And like what? Like, wasn't one of those points agriculture? Like, you hadn't really considered the implications of how we grow?
I had not really. Yeah, I had not given that as much thought, even though I do garden and grew up knowing how to grow food, eating great, garden food and cooking it. And so I knew the difference in quality and stuff, nutrition, but I really had never given serious thought to the effects of the industrial food system on our economy, on the environment. And it was a point in my life where I still was in some doubt as to human-induced climate change. So believe it or not, and you believe it because I knew climate change was happening, but I was not thoroughly convinced that human beings were the primary cause of rapid change. And so, like, you helped me tie some of these things together, and I became convinced in human-induced climate change, which has pretty much impressed me ever since as the number one problem that we need to solve or adapt to. But yeah, I learned a lot.
Yep. And so part of that whole process too, I came out of K-State, especially through all of like more the extracurricular studies I was doing. With like, I look back on it now, and I think it's accurate to call it an apocalyptic worldview, and not apocalyptic in the sense that like, the sky any day now is going to be rolled up like a scroll or something, but more so, and partly it's Naomi Klein's like shock doctrine, and this changes everything made an impression on me, where it's like we're on the cusp of a major ecological crisis that's going to like seriously challenge our day-to-day lives. And even, I would say like modernity itself is that crisis. This isn't anything new, but we're on the cusp of everything getting way more wild. And we have like an ethical and moral duty to like make wise choices. That to a greater or lesser degrees are basically self-sacrificial. For the good of other people. So when I say apocalyptic, I mean in the sense of it's like every choice we make is having these ripple effects out to the rest of the world, and it's incumbent upon us to make the right choices, even if those are to various degrees painful for us.
Right. And we're living in a society with an ideology and an economy that completely goes in the
Yeah.
opposite direction from sort of altruistic or self-sacrificing motives.
Or even forget that. For I would say just decently social motives. I think even those are mostly precluded.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm doing all this thinking about like what's to be done. And I spent a year woofing, which is an acronym for World Workers on Organic Farms. I traveled around mostly the South, working on different farms, and still I'm reading and I'm thinking and kind of what came out of that was I had this idea of, well, how do I, and like at least the people around me that get me, how do we kind of live our lives in a way that it's not to say it will like solve every problem or anything, but like how can we have like a net positive effect? And there's a series of choices being made. Like one of those is that it's probably better to stay in America, not just because like that's where I'm from and I have family, but also one temptation people have, and I wouldn't say it's necessarily wrong if they want to do this, but one temptation is to say like, well, just the first world or America or whatever is decadent and we just need to leave. So I'm going to go off to another country and just try and start over. Whereas I would have argued at the time, and I still would, that like it's really incumbent on us, the most powerful and wealthy countries on the earth, to change how we live, because we do to a greater or lesser degree, and I would say greater, set the terms for the rest of the world. So I was making a series of kind of strategic choices like that with my life. Do I leave? Do I stay? If I stay, what does that look like? And at the end of it, this acronym it came to me, because I was trying to think like what's a name or like what's a kind of a brand, even though like obviously I'm repulsed by like the corporate notion of branding. But basically, how do you form a group that is interested in food, is interested in some sort of communal living, that is like open to spirituality? What could that look like if I'm not just going to join like the Bruderhof or the Catholic Worker or some sort of like Trotskyist sect or something?
Mm-hmm.
And what came to me was Mort Collective, which is like an acronym. And so it's M:0/R/T. And the idea, it's an acronym for like Mission, Occupy, Reform, Transform. And the O, because like part of my transition from left liberalism to something more radical was realizing that like there was a lot of promise to the Occupy movement, Occupy Wall Street and all that, but also like it failed. I would say it failed. Some people disagree. I would say it failed to meaningfully change the world.
Mm-hmm. I'd agree with that.
But I still wanted to kind of like homage to, politics along those lines. And then the idea led to, okay, if people can like occupy a place and work on reforming themselves, can we be transformed people that can in turn transform the world, at least to some degree? Now this is kind of abstract, but since I'm doing all this farming, I can see that like, if people could team up, if we could collectively farm, and if we can have like community where we can rely on each other instead of like every service we need, somebody's trying to make a profit off of satisfying that need. I guess I saw promise in what is usually called like lifestyle anarchism,
Mm-hmm.
but of a kind of communal nature.
And so you talked about going to a farm in, I think it was like Missouri, and then you went down to Alabama for a while.
Uh-huh.
Was it during that period of time that you really started to think that way?
Well, so I would say real quick. So I worked at a farm in Springfield, Missouri, and then I went back to college, and then I had a couple internships. and then I woofed for a year. And it was during all those travels through like Texas, Louisiana,
Right.
Alabama, Georgia. It was all stewing like in that year, mostly in the South.
Okay.
And then I remember, I don't remember why, but I came back to Manhattan and, met some of my old acquaintances and friends. And that really got me going on like basically writing a proposal for like, hey guys, if we could get together and try and do something like this, I think it would be rad. And also, don't you see the apocalyptic import of the moment?
So you traveled around, did what wasn't about 2 years worth of that?
1 year.
1 year, okay. But at all these different farms.
Right. And maybe what you're thinking of is the next year I did go back to Selma, Alabama and work on.
Okay. Yeah. Because you were there for about a year.
Right. That was a full year after that.
Okay.
But in between the woofing and going back to that farm was me writing up the proposal and approaching people about like, guys, do you want to do this?
So what was it about that meeting in Manhattan when you came back that made you think that this might be a good idea to propose to people that you knew here?
Because to various degree, if I approached one of my acquaintances / friends about this, I had a certain understanding that either they were interested in farming, they said they were about community, and or they were miserable with their life and say they wanted to change. And so I was like, well, here you go. Here's a plan.
A lot of these people were people that were kind of either in that book group that you had headed and it started to meet at my house, or they were adjacent to it. Not all of them, but
sure. Yeah. Or they were old friends from like back before I even left Kansas.
Right. So I hadn't met, I'd met maybe a couple of them at some other function, the ones that weren't from Manhattan. But so you're saying that all of them in one way or another were expressing like dissatisfaction with the way things were, that you would have thought that they would be interested in maybe working collectively together.
Right. At a purely like rational level, it was reasonable to hope that. And again, I think I approached like 7 people, and I by no means thought like, oh, I'm just going to write this thing and I'm going to talk to people and then everybody's going to be like, wow, Spencer, that's such a good idea. Let me just up in my life and do this thing with you. But I was hoping, in retrospect, maybe I was lucky that 2 out of the 7 did say yes. But at the time, I was hoping for more.
Mm-hmm. So the 2 of the 7 were, I mean, you don't have to name names, but like characterize.
Yeah. One was about to graduate from K-State and interested in conservation, forestry, stuff like that. But through being involved in that book club, had, connected that up with agriculture and how we eat. And then, was going to graduate and was looking for the next step. And he was one, actually, I didn't want to invite him just because I didn't really know him all that well. And you were like, yeah, you should, because, he's a great guy and he's into this.
Yeah. You didn't know him too well because you had left. Well, there was some overlap there, but
minimal.
Not much. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. Enough that, like, in my mind, he didn't make the cut of like, we already have like a baseline, some level of friendship.
Mm-hmm.
Because part of what I was banking on was for the friendship to count for something, which in retrospect was naive as well. And the other guy was a friend I had made down in Springfield when I worked at a restaurant. While I worked at this restaurant part-time while I was working at that farm. And he at the time was homeless. So part of his deal is he wanted to kind of get his life together. He also wanted to like not keep sleeping in homeless shelters. And like I liked him well enough. We got along. and he's a pretty good cook. And so it seemed to be a good fit that me and one of the guys were interested in the farming, and he and the other guy wanted to cook. And the other thing, part of my proposal, where I look back on it and think I was not being totally crazy, I had a kind of loose business plan, which was, wherever we set up, we'll start farming for ourselves. We'll look for people that we can partner with to like either get income to support ourselves, or even better, if we can be farming with other people, and link up with already existing farms institutions. Let's do that. And then we'll try and like preserve and process as much of our food as possible, hopefully also sell some of that. But then where I think I was like more or less right in terms of how do you survive in this economy doing this, I was like, well, let's try and get on like social media and be like content creators, whatever that would look like getting a Patreon, because the real money won't really come from producing the food. It will be producing information about producing the food. And if the point was to like positively impact our society, that allows you to have a much wider reach. But because only the 2 of the 7 people were into it, and because all of us were interested more in the food than in the information producing. I mean, I was interested in that, but you can only do so many things in a day. So already like the aperture of my original vision versus what was coming to fruition, just at the level of like recruitment, had already constricted a lot. But you go to war with the army you've got, as Rumsfeld once said. And so I decided to go for it.
You're quoting Rumsfeld. I think we need to stop now. Do you want to characterize the like reactions that you got from other folks that decided not to join? I'm
thinking, because I've mostly, for the most part, they were unexceptional. I would say roughly half of the people just told me like, no, I can't do it because I have to be reasonable, or my desires are in a different direction. And a disappointing amount of people just didn't tell me anything at all, which was kind of a bummer.
As in, you gave it to them and you didn't get any response.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, that's never, because then you're like, did you even read it?
Sure. Yeah. Or was your response so like contemptible you don't even want to share it, or yeah. Or like, do they not know how to say no, or like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I tried not to dwell on it at the time. But it is a bummer when people that you thought were some kind of friend to you don't even bother to say no.
Yeah, sure. Well, you want to at least have an explanation or a reaction of some kind, so I get that. So we're at the stage of these 2 guys join. So unless there's something else to add about the proposal stage, maybe talk about how that started out, what you guys started to do.
Yeah, well, we had a year in between. Part of my proposal was, I'm asking everybody in the fall of 2017, but this wouldn't be starting till like 2019, because probably by that point I'd already agreed to work at the farm in Selma. The guy from K-State that was interested in farming, he actually moved out to Selma with me, and like that was his first year on a farm, or outside of the student farm. So like, we got to know each other a lot there. We made it through that year. Since we had that year off, there was a certain amount of ambiguity about, there was like, do we go to Springfield? Do we go to Kansas City? Maybe in Selma it goes well. It didn't, for the most part, it didn't. So that was wiped off the table. And it confirmed what I was saying in that proposal, that farming is very hard to make a living doing. It really is.
So, I mean, what do you mean by that? Like your experience in Selma and elsewhere confirmed that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would have all of, I mean, this could be a podcast in its own right, but like just so many absurd experiences that have just been reinforced in my time in Kansas City. But these ridiculous situations where people or farmers, everybody's trying to modify the CSA model, which for people that don't know, CSA stands for Community Supported Agriculture. And the idea with it is, at least the gold standard and how it was designed is people pay a bunch of money up front to more or less be like investors or the community supporters of this farm. Mm-hmm. And then every week or so, they get a box of the produce that's like their share of their investment. And part of the idea is that you're sharing risks with the farmer. If there's like a plague of locusts, then you won't get any production. But at least the farm hopefully won't fully go out of business. And then also there's other ideas, like usually you're supposed to go to the farm because part of it is about connecting deracinated urban consumers with the farms that are producing their land. So that's gold standard. And once the market was saturated with wealthy people who have the leisure time to be driving out to a farm every week to get a box of produce, once that market's saturated, everybody's trying to modify it. So one of the obvious things to do is like deliver it or make it highly customizable. So every week people can be selecting what they want or they don't want. And one of the ways that had gone in Selma at the farm I was on was that they were delivering. So you would be in this situation where you're pulling up to sometimes like plantation style, like almost mansions. Usually this wasn't the norm, but this was an experience for me. And they've ordered, $80 worth of meat, $10 of produce for me. I handled like the garden side of things. So like, I'm going 15 minutes one way out of the way to deliver $100 worth of produce, or not, sorry, like $15 worth of produce, in like a beat up old farm truck. And, if you were to figure out what I was getting paid, per hour, I would have been lucky to be making like $6 or $7. And that's not a complaint about the farmers because they were under tremendous stress and like just the economics don't add up with all this stuff.
Yeah, because they're competing with all the grocery stores where people can get things whenever they want to, probably for less, right? I mean, This is the main problem.
Right. Yeah, because you're not just you're competing with the grocery stores, you're competing with the food processors that are employing migrant laborers that are slicing and dicing the meat 24 hours a day, every day of the year, and putting them on semis and shipping them across the country. You're competing with a whole industrial supply chain.
Right. So the only people who could possibly get into this seriously enough to keep a farmer afloat would be people who have quite a bit of money and leisure to be able to purchase it. I mean, this is part of the dilemma, isn't it? Is that locally produced food that isn't highly subsidized in so many different ways costs more.
Yeah, but I'd say it's even worse. It's even worse than that, because if just the rich people wanted to support it, at least a certain amount of these farms could actually exist. What you find is a minority of rich people half-heartedly supporting it.
Yeah.
So it would be one thing if we could just roll up to the gated communities and just toss all the food out, but that's not the case. So it's like, it was a full half day of making deliveries to sell a few $100s worth of produce. And then again, this could be a podcast in its own right, talking with people. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm on vacation. Can you put all my stuff on hold? Because nobody ever thinks, even when they like
work in the church office, nobody thinks they would donate their food to someone else or give it away. Or that like they've kind of already like, we're already barely making any money by forming this quote unquote community supported agricultural relationship with them. And now they're making you do extra logistical work, which is like further depressing what actual money you're making, because they apparently have enough surplus time and energy to go take vacations, which I don't object to in the abstract. But then it's this absurd situation where I'm rolling up to the mansion and they're like, "Oh, I'm sorry. Can I not pay you $50 next week? Because we're trying."
Goodness.
Yeah.
Oh, I never
Anyway.
even got that when you talked to me about this long time ago. I didn't get that they were actually trying to not pay you the $50 or whatever, like for their CSA for that month. I thought the deal was they had to pay it regardless, but no.
Well, and here's how much do you want to bend as a farmer? You have to ask yourself, how much do you want to bend over backwards trying to placate a consumer that hopefully one day will pay off, or / do you risk pissing them off?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
So anyway, I could go on about the horrors of this type of stuff. Suffice it to say, I knew that farming was hard. I didn't realize quite how hard it would be when you're still not being, when you're no longer being incubated by a barely surviving farm. I thought when it was decided we go to Kansas City, I thought surely if enough of us work together and we just push in the same direction, eventually we'll get somewhere.
Mm-hmm. It would kind of stand to reason if you could get a number of people to kind of pool their resources and their work, that you could, if you had enough people and they were genuinely like pooling things together, like their housing and their food and this and that, expenses as well as their work. That
Right.
Yeah.
And we worked out, so we figured Selma wasn't the place. It was decided Springfield wasn't the place, even though I would be interested in another dimension, maybe how things went if we could have gone the Springfield route. But we went to Kansas City. We struck a deal with my Aunt Mary Farmer, who was on last episode, where we like worked off our rent. So we had me and the two guys in a 2-bedroom apartment. So we were kind of crammed in there. Like I didn't have a proper bedroom, but I was like, I have this apocalyptic mentality. This is, a chance to practice, like, in the book of Isaiah, talk about like the suffering servant or whatever. It was like, I'm serious about this. Let's get apocalyptic. Let's sacrifice now so we can live better lives in the future. Which, whatever, I'm not trying to say it was some huge deal, but I mean, I didn't have a door and I was right next to the entryway. And like whenever any drunk person came in at any hour of the day, and it was never dark enough. And it's all whatever, because I was like, we're building this community. This is our first foothold. Let's make it happen.
So 3 guys in an apartment.
3 guys in an apartment. Immediately things started going to shit, even like socially. Like the one guy, the homeless guy who like I'd gotten along with. It's one thing to get along with a guy at work. It's another thing to live with him. And it was one thing for me to live with him. It was another for the K-State alum to live with him. And the guy from Springfield admitted he immediately just started like pushing our buttons to basically find out like where the boundaries are and how much he could get away with and like assert his identity.
Oh, he admitted that.
Yeah, he did to me.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. That's
So,
aggravating. I
Sure.
thought it was just a part of his basic personality.
yeah. Yeah, you remember you found him abrasive, right?
Yeah.
And again, it's cut to 6. He only made it like 6 months before I like drove him back to Springfield in a moving van, and we put all the stuff he had accumulated into like a storage unit. But for me, the main bummer of that, outside of the fact like the huge loss of like time and mental energy and money that dealing with that like failed partnership cost me and the other guy who stayed in Mort with me, was just like this guy literally went from being homeless to like, yeah, hustling with these two younger guys. And it was unclear, you know, I could see from his perspective, even made the argument, well, I can make more money just like working in restaurants. And I'm like, maybe if you could keep it together long enough to keep working at restaurants, but
Right. He would have a job sometimes, as I recall, and then the job would go away.
Then he'd get pissed off because he discovered something about it that was bullshit. And then he would and he knew he could fall back on the two of us to keep the apartment rolling, and he could work off his share of the rent for Mary. And
was that
so
the main thing that he did was, or what was the deal for him to stay
with Mary?
Yeah, and just with you guys, like what was he supposed to be doing?
Well, he was supposed to be kind of being part of the local food scene, in his case through working in kitchens, so that as we put our roots down in Kansas City, that we would have the connections and the know-how of like how things worked, that we could have a functional operation. Now I say that, does that sound crazy? Like as a plan?
No, not as a concept. You know, if he had been more, I guess, stable in being able to keep jobs, or yeah, if he'd have had his act more together, he could have at least been somewhat of a bridge to restaurants. And yeah, I kind of remember you kind of wanting him to do a little bit of cooking as a part of the deal too, but am I wrong about that?
Yeah, well, that was in the mix, especially when he wasn't working in the restaurants. It's like, could you at least like make us dinner if we're both
Right.
You know, if we're all out working and we're paying for the food, then it's fine, but could you like have a dinner ready or something? And sometimes he would, and sometimes he wouldn't. And the other thing I tried to toy with was like, could we out of that kitchen, and it wasn't a great kitchen, but you go to war with what you have. Could we do some catering on a very small scale? Like, I started working at the nonprofit that I'm still with for the time being, and we were like going out to eat for lunch, and I'm like, well, I can't just cater. We'll warm it up. We'll have better quality ingredients. It'll cost about the same. What's not to like? Although immediately what you find is people are like, well, it's cheaper if I go to Chipotle. And I'm like, what we're working at a local urban farming outfit, and you're trying to like pinch pennies to go to Chipotle, when, by the way, somebody needs to drive 20 minutes into downtown to get it. But this is what we're working with. But again, his lack of stability was so profound that even when the rest of Mort was giving him the stability of like, look, you have an apartment, look, we know where this food you're going to make is going. Yes, you're not making a great income per se, but you were literally homeless 4 months ago.
Right. Yeah, it's a step up for sure.
And I'm not trying to like wield my privilege and ask you to kiss my ass and even have a good attitude about it. But like, are we in this boat together? And like, are we rowing in somewhat the same way? But I've learned that to see it that way, you kind of had to have my apocalyptic, relatively clear mentality, instead of this is just how I feel today. And that's what's going to guide my actions.
So, I mean, one through thread, it seems to me, is just like the difficulty of dealing with personalities. I think, all the way through your story has been, even moving forward, I mean, peppered with, how do you deal with the fact that people oftentimes just do not get along or are unreasonable and emotional and, all these things, right?
To the point of being basically absolutely dysfunctional. And this is where I was wildly naive in what people, or at least people conditioned by like the current material circumstances of our country are like, but we are not capable of that kind of concerted long-term effort with other people.
Well, maybe particularly somebody like that who's had a very, difficult life and is kind of, in a way, kind of beaten down by the experience of life and may just not ever be able to, like, I don't know, get it together enough, to share the same vision, but you wouldn't know that going into this. But it just sounds like he just wasn't ever going to be able to get there.
I guess, and here's where it's not like I just scooped a guy up at random. It's like I'd known him for years.
Right.
We talk semi-regularly even after I moved away. I wrote up the whole proposal package where I think I was relatively clear. I was living with the dude if he ever wanted to ask about things. And even, the other guy in Mort, he was really struggling. And I think one of the things that kind of like reinvigorated him is we went to this church for a while. We were going to this kind of like post-evangelical, like crypto Presbyterian church. And like right at the right time, one of the pastors gave this sermon from the book of Ruth. And there was all this exegesis about this phrase in the book about like helping people like not fall through the cracks. And that hit, I think, especially him to some extent me, but like the other guy, we kind of resolved to like, yes, this is hard, but like we're trying to help him out. And that bought some time, but like he was just so unstable and so unpleasant to deal with. And even, I mean, it takes a fair amount to get under my skin, but like I would be driving home already having like fights with him in my head and like hoping he's pissed off, because at least if he's pissed off, he's going to be hanging out in his room and I won't have to deal with him. Whereas if he's in a good mood, he's going to want to talk to me. Which is like not trying to brag about that, but that's where I was at.
Sounds like a bad marriage is what it sounds like.
Yeah, sure. And if some, for my like Republican parents to be like, see, this is why we just live in our own little silos and mind our own business. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, you can see how, especially if people have experiences like that, which we often do with friendships or trying to get even much less serious, like cooperation going with people. I could, but I won't list like on a couple of hands the number of times I've tried to join some sort of group and been driven off by the fact that there's some obnoxious or crazy person involved that's just driving me absolutely crazy and that's stopping anything positive from happening. It's really very common. I hope I've never been one of those people, but like, but it can sometimes boil down to just one person, but they just disrupt everything because they just can't rein it in, or get some perspective on their role relative to other people,
Mm-hmm.
So it's easy to retreat to the silo and just say, you know what, I've tried and I'm happier not doing it. So,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the things that I hear when you tell this story is that working with other people in anything like a close way is really difficult.
Mhm.
It's just really difficult, and somehow that has to be worked through in order for anything good to happen.
Maybe. Yeah. And especially in this situation where it's not like there's just this one problematic person in a group that we all sort of voluntarily attend, but when you're literally trying to like live and work together
Yeah.
with somebody,
Right.
everything was exponentially exacerbated. Right. And I would say part of the wonders of capitalism is that it is a way to basically get everybody to behave in certain ways and fulfill certain roles that, a large amount of people that worked up in this country or woke up in this country and went to work did not do it because they totally love what they're doing.
Right. Yeah. They do it because they need the money so that they can hopefully kind of protect themselves from having to deal with other people, or so it, so it seems.
Right.
Yeah, it's like a phenomenon, right, of this people under 30 in particular who are just literally, they're working from home. They're not going anywhere. They don't have a social life. And they're not dating even. They're not out there. So it's kind of come to a critical pass. This is like the opposite of it's the opposite end of the spectrum of what you were trying to do with Mort, is
Sure.
the isolated individual stuck in their home,
Sure.
not leaving at a point in their life when they really ought to be, like, they say all the statistics say, like, all the pathologies of youth are going down because they're literally not going out. They're not doing things. So, yeah, although the guy that you're talking about wasn't that young, but I mean, it's a growing problem, and probably part of the reason why people do that is because they've just, every time they try, it's quite a hassle.
And yet we all, even if it's in veiled ways, the fact that people can hang out in their houses or their apartments is because the gas and the electricity keep flowing, the water keeps flowing, the food keeps being delivered to them, the entertainment and through the inner tubes, the interweb tubes keep flowing. So it's not like these are just asocial people. They're being cosseted by late capitalism.
Right. They're getting a sort of simulacrum of a social engagement, but
right. And I'll grant, if they want to say, how is me wasting my life playing like video games or watching movies any dumber than what I experienced trying to start Mort?
All I can say in response, having seen plenty, of the other, type of thing happen to people, is at least what you did was definitely more exciting and interesting. But, but I can understand, since we have the ability to retreat, people didn't used to have that, right? But now we have this ability, lots of us anyway, to like create this bubble around ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so we do. And
Yep.
it takes, I mean, you're describing, how hard it can be to like get out of that. But at any rate, so you drive the guy back to
Springfield.
Springfield.
Sure.
Okay.
And again, that could be its own podcast, all surreal. He says he doesn't have money. He's like, oh, can we stop at this convenience store and buy a bunch of junk food? And for me, it's just like rubbing my nose and the fact that like, oh, you wanted something different, but how about you facilitate my self-destructive and totally unhealthy ways of living? But whatever. In the meantime, like the rest of the year, like we sold basically nothing. So the other half of Mort at this point, one of his stories is he went to I think the best barbecue restaurant I found in town and he was trying to sell them produce. And this is like a relatively nice, like it's in the Westport district, which is kind of like the hipster bar area. He pulled, he rolled up trying to sell him kale for whatever it was, $3 or $4 a bundle. And the chef took him into the office and was like, look at this. And he opened up like a Cisco catalog, and he's like, unless you can sell this kale for like less or at $1.25 a pound, I don't have anything to talk to you about. And
Wow.
and I would argue it's nice that the chef was like that honest with him.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, I knew prices were tight. I didn't realize that you literally had to go to the quarter against Cisco at a pretty nice restaurant. Like their entrees are what? Start at least 15. But that's how bleak it was. We sold basically nothing. But you know, when you're more or less in an arrangement that most people associate with like people like cohabitating or married, like I was bringing in the income from the greenhouse, the other guy was doing the farming that didn't make any money. Yeah, I don't know.
You were using like land that you did not own, but you were being allowed to farm.
Right. We got a good lease where we were at.
Right.
But all we did that year was lose money because we couldn't sell any of it. And we even tried some things. So this came on later, but I got involved with a woman who is from a relatively prestigious and wealthy family. And we tried to do like a CSA to them. And again, you would think people that have so much money wouldn't bicker with you over like $30. But they do. If they're even, if they even care. Yeah, it's weird.
It is weird.
It still kind of blows me away. But I guess the argument is people have this idea that like, oh, if all the wealthy people, it's a species of utopian socialism to say if the wealthy people would just share their money, everything would be fine. But it's like, even if that were true, and I don't think it is, wealthy people are conditioned by their habits to not share their money. So if you're the type of person that has become wealthy, it's probably because you are to a greater or lesser degree miserly.
Well, but I would agree with that some of the time, but I think also, vegetables are not what people highly value. They should value, they should value the food that they eat because it's literally what keeps them alive. It make them live longer or less long. It's literally, the stuff of life. But just like with childcare and elder care and other things that are kind of essential, people don't actually value them highly. And then what they would pay you for, I think, is if you were some master storyteller that could make them feel like this was like, I don't know, gold that they were buying and that there was a story behind it. And they were part of a community and all of these different things that people pay money for that are immaterial, right? But if you could spend half of your time creating this wonderful narrative that they could get into and feel good about, you probably could sell you could double your price and they'd probably pay.
Well,
but a different business.
But here's another example of how I was naive. It's like, sorry, I thought like Michael Pollan and Dan Barber and all of the documentaries had already created the social context in these left liberal progressive circles, where I thought like that Disney World in their heads had already been created. And I was just here saying, here we go. Do you want to do it? I got you your produce. It's not perfect, right. But if you buy this, and if enough of you buy this, then we can keep doing this and it'll keep getting better.
So there's this, and I think that they would, like if you asked them, that group of people would know exactly what you're talking about as far as Michael Pollan and Dan Barber and the whole like.
They'll read the New Yorker or whatever.
Yeah, right. They're generally aware, but they have not linked that up to their purchasing habits, which is bizarre. I think.
Yeah, or it's like they are. I mean, these people are shopping at Whole Foods, like, and they're going out to fancy restaurants, and part of it they're taking lots of vacations in the summer.
Mm-hmm.
But I think partly it's a testament to how the organic movement has been like recuperated, that these people are buying better, but they're not necessarily buying local or hyper local, and they're not wanting to support somebody like me.
Right, totally. Amazon owns Whole Foods.
Well, no. When did? Yeah.
Oh, that was maybe 5 years ago or more. I mean, it's been a while now. And you know, like it's a way for people to feel kind of good, but they're basically buying the same stuff they could buy at any other grocery store. They might have to hunt around for it a little bit more, but they have been recuperated, because that's just, we're giving you a grocery store that looks like what you want. You know, that's the way I see it.
And I want to believe that it's still better to get some organic olive oil than not.
But you can get that at Dillon's.
Yeah. Now you can. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You can get organic stuff at the grocery store that isn't as great as like locally produced, because it's not as fresh and you don't know where it came from. But there's a lot of organic options now at a regular grocery store.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Mass market organic.
Yep. And so, yeah, the year ended, you know, things, at least for a while, intensified with that woman. I briefly bumped up against like the Harvard social circle and realized that like, oh, these people are like as much hood rats as the people I went to college with. They're just like talking about Kierkegaard. So that was somewhat disillusioning, as well as in the same trip, I visited Elliot Coleman's farm. And I mean, he was nothing but nice to me and his daughter. So like, I want to say like, I'm grateful to them that they let me have that experience, but it was a weird and kind of unhealthy farm, I felt like, which for me was another layer of, it's like, okay, so like, to a greater or lesser extent, all the farms I've been involved with are very problematic. Mort is not going well. But then I'm on this farm. For people that don't know, Elliot Coleman kind of like is maybe the single most pivotal person to spread organic farming in this country. He did a lot of research in the 60s and 70s. Figuring out specifically like how the French would run market gardens and small scale homesteads. And he did a lot to popularize that and organic farming in general. His like the new organic grower, like when I started farming, the Bible was the new organic grower. Now it's kind of been replaced by whatever the title of Jean-Martin Fortier's book is. Mm-hmm. But even in that book, in the intro, he pays fealty to Elliot Coleman. Mm-hmm. And I say all this because I'm on this prolific farm with like the most beautiful soil I've ever seen, growing great plants. And I'm not really privy to the details, but I'm pretty sure they're not doing that great financially.
Mm-hmm. And if he can't do that,
then who can? Yeah. So part of for like the 5 people that are listening to this, if you're thinking I'm just being like a whiny baby, what I'm really whining about isn't like my failures, because I would be mostly like reconciled to those failures if I felt like in general, like the world was getting better, or that like the organic farming scene, it had left me behind, but at least it's going somewhere. But even Elliot Coleman's farm is having, again, I'm not trying to like spread gossip or I don't know the details, but I can tell you there are issues. And partly I was keyed into this because his daughter wrote a book, it's a controversial book, but basically she talks about all the flaws of like growing up in that world. And there was this utopian dream that we could like create our own lives and take care of each other in a truly healthy way. And her conclusion is basically farming is too hard. Families can't take it on alone. And her family was destroyed in part because of the drive to make the farm succeed.
Because it literally took so much focus and so much work that everything else kind of went by the wayside.
Yeah, among other things, like there was like a tragic death in the family. But I think it's telling, you put those two books together, The New Organic Grower, at least I haven't read the new edition, but at least in the old one early on, there's a section where Elliot's like, well, who will work on the farm? And he's like, well, you can pay some people, but the family will work on the farm. And meanwhile, his daughter has written a book. I think they should be sold together, these two books. Her daughter's written a book saying, the farm destroyed my family.
Yeah. Well, it's not supported. This is why, like, it's not supported by the rest of society. It's not supported by the government. It's not supported by the consumers. So it doesn't have the stability that it ought to have. And I mention the government because the rest of our agricultural system is definitely supported by the government. So, but it's decided not to support this type of agriculture. So then they don't get the guarantees, they don't get the subsidies.
Yep.
And they're probably just constantly on the edge of failing, most of these farms. And that puts a lot of stress on marriages and families.
Right. And yet it's controversial to say that, because what's implicit is that therefore they're basically successful because of idiosyncratic manias on the part of the people that are making them successful. They're successful to the extent that they basically find alternative sources of revenue, which for Elliot Coleman was like writing the books and getting speaking engagement proceeds. You can go into tourism, you can go into like wedding events, you can go into education, but they're all basically kind of like what I was trying to do with Mort. The farming is the loss leader to the actual moneymaker. That's one way you go. And then psychologically, it's embedded, I'm increasingly convinced, in this like yeoman farmer, Jeffersonian, Jacksonian democracy, where we want to believe the rugged, entrepreneurial, pioneering, straight white male will forge his destiny and the nation with him. And that this is still in play, I think, even among the so-called like woke progressives, that there's still this kind of egocentric super ego thing going on, where what's fueling them is something like that.
Yeah,
I don't know. That's my rant, but
I think that was well put, and I tend to agree with it. I think that we don't tell people the truth.
We don't tell ourselves the truth.
Yeah, I mean both ways, but the myth sells, right? Like it sells books, it sells documentaries, it sells all this the tourism and everything else that you mentioned, but and it sucks people in. Do you feel like sucked in at all? In other words, like, do you feel like that all this stuff that you sort of that persuaded you initially to get into this was kind of a myth or a deception?
Yes, I think so. I mean, it's not my primary feeling. Like, I have a lot of conflicted feelings about all of this, about Kansas City farming in general, and then the wider organic local farming scene. But a portion of me is butthurt because I feel like I showed up with relatively pure motives, which is not to say that I'm a perfect person, but like I really was like, I'm here to self-sacrifice for the good of the cause. Let's go.
Right.
And then it's like, what's the cause?
Yeah. And is anybody here with me? Yeah. Even though a lot of people say they are, I think that's, that needs to be repeated, that, and anybody out there who's listening, who says that stuff and pays attention to that stuff but doesn't act on it, hear this, like try to follow through on what you think and say, because it really matters. It matters to other people who care about these things. So, because I mean, we both see this, like all of us see this like repeatedly, that people hold these ideas in their heads and that kind of helps them form their identity. But when it comes to changing the way they live, it never really happens. Even the ones with really good intentions who really talk a good line. And that all adds up to this can't work.
Yeah. Yep. But so, yeah, my ass is chapped after 2019. We head into 2020. Things keep getting more tense with the other half of Mort. We ended up we acquired a couple houses and then some land across the street, which we're still at. And right around that time, COVID, lockdown type stuff started happening. Which like kind of raised the stakes and to some extent was an exciting time insofar as like, we lost our restaurant. What sales were happening to the nonprofit we sold to? Those collapsed, but we had just joined the food hub, the Kansas City Food Hub, which the idea is that it's like a co-op owned by farmers and they market and distribute your product. And 2020 was a good year for us because they really hustled they lost their institutional and restaurant buyers, but they started marketing direct to rich people, kind of that modified CSA model we were talking about. And like, we had good sales. I was on the sales department. I was kind of confident going into 2022 or maybe not confident, but optimistic, because we were at least like selling some product that like, if you looked at like the Excel document was like, oh, if we can get better at producing stuff and keep doing this, like if this bar graph keeps going up, or bar graph, what do they call with the arrow?
Line graph.
If this line graph keeps going up, we're really going to get somewhere. But halfway through the year, the other guy I started Mort with left, in part because I think he'd lost faith in the mission and with me. And he had some family health issues as well.
Now, could you back up and explain just a bit, like why or how he lost faith?
We're getting into speculation because like as time went on, he grew more and more like distant with me. So I can't fully say, and we've never fully, like, I'm not mad at him. I'm actually grateful because, he's one of the few people, where like I have no real like I think he gave all he had and he tried and I hope he figures it out wherever he's at. But I'm speculating because we've never fully like reconciled or come to terms with what happened. I'm sure being around me that intimately for that long, like familiarity bred contempt. He saw all sorts of weaknesses on my part. So I'm sure that's in the mix, that maybe if I had been a better, stronger person, he would have had more faith in me as a comrade or something like that in this project. So I will take responsibility that I should have worked smarter, harder, and like been a better friend and like business partner with him. So, to some extent, I would levy the same criticism at him, but like I said, he tried more than almost anybody else. So that's the intersubjective angle. And I would say objectively, the contradiction in what I was trying to do with the lifestyle anarchism is I was kind of trying to have it both ways. I was trying to be like, hey, what if we're all basically like collective entrepreneurs and we can bootstrap our way to communism? And having kind of gone down this road, who wants to be an entrepreneur? It's very hard. It's very stressful. You know, I was thinking about earlier today, I was like on top of a scaffolding without a railing, like hammering in nails in with a hammer. And I was like, I wonder if, because I was kind of processing this upcoming interview, I wonder to what extent doing this has felt like a social vertigo, kind of like what I'm doing here. Like, this is dangerous. Like, I should just go get a job. I can just show up, half-ass my 8 hours, collect a paycheck, and it's over. I don't have to think about, like, what am I going to do tomorrow? How are we going to, like, leverage the resources we have? How are we going to go round up sales? How are we going to do all these different tasks?
When you say, like, entrepreneur, bootstrap your way to communism, are you basically saying, you know, you'd have to work hard to, like, sort of make enough income, pull it together so that you could so that you could continue to live communally, maybe find some other people still to do it with? I mean, what do you mean exactly at that point?
Right. Like, I mean, the contradiction that I was trying to sort of like surmount was, how do we be a bunch of liberal individuals who have to like figure things out on a market? How do we get from that to living lives together where we have, at least to some degree, control over our diets and our housing and, you know, our jobs, basically, what kind of jobs we do, how we do them, what we direct them towards. And then further out, part of me would like to have some sort of political agency. Like, I think one of the problems, if you're the type of American that like wants some sort of like, these are like antiquated terms, but in terms of like 2020 politics, if you want some sort of like Bernie Sanders or like Andrew Yang, like policy shift, my argument would be, unless you have a different kind of society that can like absorb the extra money coming at you, then it'll just flow right out. Like, one example, let's say your income goes up $1,000 because you get a UBI, but if you still have to pay your landlord rent, why is your rent not going to go up when they realize functionally what's happened is the economy has just been inflated?
Yeah, absolutely would. Yeah. So you're saying that unless people could pool their resources more,
right,
and return, or I guess evolve towards a more communal way of living, where people were able to pool resources and cooperate, any
right,
sort of government aid would simply just be inflationary.
right.
You just, prices would go up and nothing would. Yeah, I think that totally makes sense. I mean, we have this bizarre situation that never existed, I think, in human history before, in which people don't live communally, right? Like, for most of human history, at least families did, didn't expect all the kids to go off and just be completely on their own. They live in the same area, extended families, and then beyond, neighbors cooperating. Within my own dad's lifetime, there was a lot more of that, right? So now we can't go back to that exactly, but I think it stands to reason that we can't always be here. This is unsustainable, right? This unsustainable level of like consumption. And so it makes sense that we would have to, at some point down the line, cooperate again more fully, and therefore not need as much money. Because there's a lot of people now who can't even get a full-time job, or they can't get a job that pays well or with any sort of benefits. That's probably not going to change either. So what if these people actually started living together or living on the same block together, you know, and were able to work together so that they didn't need to have like the full-time stable job that they're never going to have again.
Right. And also, who do you really want that anyway?
I mean, I like mine, but it's because it's a great job. I hear you when, you know, most people don't have jobs that they love to go to.
Yeah.
Most people have, you know, shitty jobs that they don't want to do. And so, you know, you're asking the wrong person. I realize I'm in a very, very lucky situation here. And one that's becoming even rare for academics to have, you know. So yeah, for most people, do they want to work full time? I would hope not, you know, like there are other aspects of life that have been sorely neglected, including primarily family. It's so ironic to me, you know, that neoliberal capitalism is often kind of equated with, a system that supports the family. But it does destroy the family because people don't have enough time to like support each other. Everybody has to work or everybody's off doing their own thing. So I've always liked the idea of creating some sort of model of people living together or living in proximity to each other, sharing things and labor and cooperating. And it's just a matter of, you know, can it happen now and under what circumstances? If it can. And I don't know. Do you want to like say anything more about why that particular partnership didn't work, or do you have any thoughts about just like is what you did and the fact that it failed, so to speak, does that say that this can't be done? I mean, what kind of lessons do you take away from that?
I mean, I wouldn't want to abstract away from this particular interest and from this particular instance. I wouldn't want to say because this relationship or this model of trying to do things failed, you can't do other things. But yeah, or there's no other way to make things work. But I do think now whenever I run into somebody who's like, hey, doesn't this make sense in theory? I'm like, yeah, lots of things make sense in theory. But you're assuming that all these dominoes are lined up and just going to fall the way you want them to. Whereas actually, what if the dominoes are like lined up against you? And that for me, the takeaway is, yeah, it's not like nothing can work, but also I think what I encountered is probably more normal than not. And certainly within the people that we've encountered in Kansas City, the tragedy of the last guy who started Mort with me leaving is that he got it more than 99.9% of the people that would even claim they get it, which isn't even most of them. Or isn't most people. And two moments I wrote on this timeline, two moments that have always stuck with me is towards the end we did a plant sale because part of it too, like we're in COVID lockdown. Supposedly some people are interested in gardening. The CEO at the whatever, let's just say it. I work at this nonprofit called the Urban Farming Guys in Kansas City. If people are interested, the classic video is Farming in the Hood 2. Not 1, not 3, but 2. He had this idea that we should do a plant sale. He kind of facilitated it, but we did most of the work. One of the things that always struck me, we increasingly were getting into like work arguments with each other. And in one of those, he said, why are we even doing a plant sale? And that always just struck me about like, what do you mean? Why are we doing it? That's totally, yeah, maybe it's a little out there. Like the plan wasn't just to move to Kansas City and sell seedlings, but it didn't seem like that much of a jump for me.
Mm-hmm. What
Uh,
what do you think that you should have been doing?
Something that hopefully made money or got us traction somewhere, and or wasn't as physically and mentally draining, I guess.
Okay.
And another memory that's always struck me is we did one of our first food hub orders. So we just packaged up, I don't know, probably 30 pounds of lettuce, give or take 10 pounds. And we just got off of having another one of those like work fights or whatever. And we finished the order, bagged it up, put it in the fridge. We kind of talked for a little bit more, hugged it out, and then we'd parked on different sides of the greenhouse. And so I'm putting a few things away, and I look up, and I watch him finish walking out of the greenhouse, and he just left the door wide open and just took off. So then I go and I close the greenhouse on that side. Then I walk back to the end I was on, and I close up, and I go home. And that's always just struck me as he was always kind of, his mind would drift, aloof Mensch, as the Germans say. But to me, it was an example of like, we'd put in a full day and he was checked out, couldn't even close the door. And I think that's where one way, that image is a way to phrase a lot of what I've been complaining about with people. Just walked out the door, no thought about, does the door need closed? Does the light need to come off? And maybe it's more than the flesh can bear.
So it symbolizes a sort of tendency to check out. Is that what you're saying?
I think so, yeah. And or like burnt outness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Like mental exhaustion.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. All right. So now you're at the point where he's left too. And what did you do? At what point of the year did he leave? Like, did he leave after? And I think he left in the middle of the growing season, didn't he?
Yeah, like June or July, something like that. And right around the time Emily started showing up and volunteering.
Yeah. So I kind of remember you had a course with him leaving that left kind of a gap in things that you'd already committed to. But
yeah. Well, yeah, because keep in mind that this guy, before I'd acquired these properties, I was like, are you sure about this? Like, are we still trying to do more? Is this the right move? And he's like, yeah, I'm in it with you. Mm-hmm. And then a few months later, he's gone. So now I'm like a one-man collective. And it's like, what do you do?
Properties. Yeah, right. And by the way, we might mention the properties in this area of Kansas City are dirt cheap. Okay. So like it's a pretty desolate area of eastern Kansas City. So acquiring properties is not too hard to do, but it's a matter of if you can find one that you could actually grow on. And I do remember, like when you started looking, you tested the soil and stuff because there's a lot of industrial
lead pollution and
yeah. So you've got you had at the time, I would say 2.5 houses, right? Like one that was kind of falling down, one that was halfway decent, and one that was not falling down.
Yeah. Well, we didn't acquire the house that Nick's living in. Nick, who we interviewed about the fracking last season.
Oh, I thought, okay, I got that wrong.
That wasn't for another year or two. Okay. But yeah. So it was a bummer,
Right.
But we still had good hub sales. Not that still involved like making money, but at least it was some encouraging, like countervailing symbol. There were still some interns from UFG I was managing. In the fall, we started taking in woofers because there was an empty house, right? And so it's like, well, we could sign up for woofers. And the front half of the house was like a garden shed, basically, but the back half was just not in great shape, but for temporary farm work.
Yeah, it's sloping about 25 to 30 degrees. So
Yeah, it's got some foundation issues, but which is that's a whole nother side topic of I just wanted to farm with my friends. And now it's like, well, now you own a house with foundation issues. How about dropping 10 to 30 grand to fix that? Or how crazy do you want to get, you know? Or are you going to take time off from your day to figure out how to deal with foundation stuff?
Right. Good question.
So I started out with relatively the best of intentions, and pretty quickly you get into some like hot water. 10 years from leaving the Democratic Party to now.
Okay. Yeah, that's all right. 10 years.
And maybe I should have just stayed in and been a Warren Democrat and become a lawyer.
Oh. Well, life would be a little bit less interesting if you had, but something tells me you wouldn't be able to pull that off given your personality, but I can see where you might think it would be easier at times. All right. So
but instead of that, that year we also started mowing. I make more money mowing than I do gardening. And we started volunteering at the Catholic Worker down the street. Anyway, that's like the end of year 2 into 2020, more or less. I mean, we're simplifying, but that's the first 2 years of Mort. The CEO of the nonprofit I work for started the year with a bang because like I learned about January 6th. This is the trade-off. I don't get to be a wealthy Warren Democrat, but I get to learn about January 6th because your boss is there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Although he wasn't one of the stormers, and he maintains it's like an Antifa false flag operation, that none of the good God-fearing people were actually doing it. It was an attempt to defame their character.
All right.
What? But anyway, 2021, after the rich people or the wealthy people that in the short run were supporting the Food Hub CSA, modified CSA model, in 2021, those sales tank. So then that was another discouraging symbol that like we had awful sales.
And it's because at that time, like COVID was, the rules are becoming a little more lax. So people are going out more, people are doing things, and they're this like motif of like, we're in lockdown, but like now's like the best time to be supporting farmers, like also fell away too as our normalcy grew back, I guess. So
Yeah.
I think that's a large part of how that also happened.
Yeah, I think it happened here too. The local farmers here got a huge boost. And then as soon as things started getting back to normal, that just came to a halt. It's like people were concerned about scarcity for a while, and they thought, oh, well, I can hook up to a local farmer, so they took advantage of that, but they didn't learn anything from, that the lesson that should have been learned there is you should always be somewhat concerned about scarcity and your food supply. And maybe now that you've, been impacted by a pandemic, maybe you'll remember that, but no.
But they don't have an apocalyptic worldview. They have like a banal nihilistic worldview where it's just about like maintaining their comfort.
Yeah. And one thing I do have that's made it a little bit easier for me to understand your perspective is that I can imagine the worst case scenario on any given day. So like, it's not hard for me at all to like see that connection, because I have a pretty large imagination. So.
And yet, so most people just don't? Or what is your defense?
I know I can see, but like, for instance, I was talking to my like church group the other day about the whole session was about the latest school shooting. And the only contribution I had was this stuff happens every day all around the world. And the world is an ugly place. And if you don't understand that relative to God, then you might need to like think a little bit harder about what you think of God, because that's the world. It didn't just happen in one school on this day, you know? So I don't know, maybe it's being a political scientist or whatever, but I'm keenly aware of the incredible, you know, cruelty and violence and stupidity and stuff that goes on every day. We just don't see. It doesn't make it into our news. But I think that other people could be aware of that. It's not that hard to be, you know, even to be aware of it just by logical. You don't even need to read the news. You could just you could just logically think about it and realize this. But like, people seriously don't want to. It's unpleasant. I think a lot of people can't live with that awareness. It's depressing or whatever.
Right. So it's better to just whistle past the graveyard.
Yeah, but if you do that, then you're not really quite living, because you're not in this world. This world is all of that. So,
And couldn't that also be just like a critique of secularism in general, of like, I don't know, not fully being aware of like the reality that we're living in? And I don't know, at least that's what that sounds like to me. But
yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, to the extent that people think that they can, like, human beings can handle and are handling all situations through the use of their science, technology, government, this and that, and that is all going to work out okay, then absolutely. Because if you are aware of, you know, a higher power, you also have to admit that you aren't, and human beings aren't capable of the level of control and perfection that people can conjure in their minds.
Sure.
That's really going on. It's like people say, oh, you know, like if there is a problem, it's okay because we're on our way, progress. We're going to fix it all.
Yep. I think that's part of how, especially like people that identify as liberals, how they hold it together is they have like a Whig theory of history. And we're just progressing. And therefore, because the future is guaranteed better, then it doesn't matter if the too much. You can be reconciled if there are problems now, especially if you're privileged, because we just have to keep riding this escalator.
Right. Support the right causes, have faith in science and reason, and, you know, we'll get out of this.
Right.
Which is why I think even amongst like progressives, there's no real full-time comprehension of climate change. It kind of like gets in their head every once in a while. They realize it, and then it flies back out again. You know, they can't hold on to it enough to like act.
Because I keep thinking it comes back to they don't want to be agents. They want to be patients. They want to be like passive subjects that like history will just change. Instead of they might have to do something to actually change history.
Yeah, I think that's right. If you're part of this evolutionary process, then all you have to do is kind of just come along for the ride and generally assent.
But,
right. You know, if you really look around, it doesn't look like some of these major problems are being fixed too quickly. Yeah. But anyway.
In fact, a lot of them look like they're actually getting worse.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And this is setting aside the fact that, like, if you're not a religious person, then what is the basis of this belief? You know, especially when I come across like these ideas and like younger people our age, it's like, are you reading Hegel or like Alfred North Whitehead, or like where are you getting these ideas that things are just going to keep getting better? Like like on what basis?
I know. At the same time, they definitely complain about they're probably never going to get like a stable job with a good income, or, I mean, they are aware, for the most part, climate change is getting worse. But you're right, like they too kind of slip in and out, probably for the same reason, they want to believe. They want to believe. It is a sort of alternative secular faith. I was just reading Milton Friedman today, of all people. Friedman from 1951 very transparently called neoliberalism a faith. He was proposing it as a faith. I'm going to be using that in my book.
Yeah,
It is a faith.
it sure is.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also a social reality that we're all trapped in.
Yeah.
So